Welcome back, young scholars. In this video, we'll be discussing Communist China in the 20th century. The big questions you should be able to answer after watching this video are, first, how did Mao implement Marxist theory of communism in China? And that will be a pickup from where we left off in the last video. And then, will the 21st century be dominated by China? So first, how did Mao implement Marxist theory of communism in China? In the last video, we discussed how Mao faced this significant challenge of having to implement Marx's ideas of communism, but in a society which had failed to really begin the process of industrialization. And so Mao relied more heavily on the peasants rather than the factory workers to be his primary support. Once Mao had implemented the first 5-year plan, after the results of that first 5-year plan, he was recognizing that there was this growing disparity or gap between the urban factory workers and the rural peasants that were the base for his support. And Mao was concerned that there was this inequality that needed to be addressed. What Mao does is he creates a series of policies known as the Great Leap Forward from 1958 to 1960. And he promotes small-scale industrialization to be brought to the rural parts of China. He develops these communes, these collectivized farms in the rural parts of China. But on the communes, you also will see images showing industry, or what are attempts at industry, these backyard furnaces which were designed to build steel. Now what the Chinese did was they started tossing all of their scrap metal from their various tools, their bed frames, their walks, into these backyard furnaces with the goal of producing higher quality steel. What they ended up with was really just a bunch of crap, useless steel. So this was a terrible failure because it also diverts resources from the rural parts of China, which are producing food, to produce this steel that ultimately becomes worthless. Mao also has these sort of crazy ideas about waging war against the sparrow, a bird. And for 3 days, the Chinese go out and they make all kinds of noise. And as a result, many of these sparrows die of anxiety. And the thinking was these sparrows would eat the wheat crop, which they did, but the sparrows were also very useful to the Chinese ecosystem because the sparrows also ate bugs. And once the sparrows weren't there, you had this outbreak of locust in the next growing season, which still destroyed a lot of the crops. These were really bad ideas. The Chinese also decided to plant their crops more closely together and just add a little bit more fertilizer, thinking that would somehow lead to higher grain production. And in fact, it didn't. They created, though, these propaganda images showing children literally standing on top of fields of grain that were so closely grown. But in reality, these were just photoshopped images to try and persuade people that these policies of Mao Zedong were successful. But ultimately, the Great Leap Forward was an epic failure. 30 million Chinese people died of starvation. That is just an incredibly massive number. Again, we don't want to compare demographic disasters, but that's sort of on the same scale as the Great Dying, which resulted from the Columbian Exchange and the bringing over of diseases from the old world to the new world. Now, if you were an opponent of Mao Zedong, if you were raising concerns about the policies that he was putting forth, those opponents were oftentimes rounded up, they were killed, they were sent to re-education camps where they were taught to value and appreciate Mao Zedong even more. And we see that sort of repression taking place in many of these socialist states, including the Soviet Union. So as time passes and we move into the 1960s, Mao has this perception that China is moving further away from their goals of achieving a communist state. And so Mao decides that he needs to try and recommit China to the principles of socialism. So from 1966 to 1976, Mao attempts to recapture the goals of communism and ultimately to crush capitalist thought and Western thought and democratic thought, which Mao believed was starting to seep into the Chinese state. So what Mao does is he identifies the group that is most impressionable to lead this revolutionary moment in Chinese history, and that would be young people, middle schoolers, high schoolers, and Mao recruits them for these groups called the Red Guards. And the Red Guards would wear these sashes, and they would sort of travel around China in sort of awe of Mao. And they would have their little red books, which were books containing quotes of Mao Zedong. They were on the lookout for people holding these sort of old ideas or these Western democratic ideas. And oftentimes girls were involved, and so we see again this sort of evidence of this changing gender roles for women in China. Now the Red Guards would oftentimes very publicly identify people that they believed of holding these old ideas. They would publicly torture them, beat them. Again, young people can sometimes get very excited and sometimes too excited by an idea. In this case, this sort of commitment to reinvigorating socialist goals and values within Chinese society was something that maybe went a little bit too extreme of a direction. Now, why would the people continue to follow Mao Zedong despite the failures of the Great Leap Forward and despite some of the problems associated with the Cultural Revolution? Well, it was probably because Mao was a master of propaganda. He was oftentimes depicted in images sort of hanging out as a man of the people amongst the Chinese peasants, or maybe at a younger age, sort of this Jesus-like figure walking on the various mountaintops in China. Now, there are other world leaders in the 20th century that were good at this, whether they be Stalin or even modern day Kim Jong-un creates these images that are sort of larger than life of himself. Putin is a master of this, showing images of himself riding bare-chested or petting tigers. And this is known as the cult of personality. So cult of personality is when a leader uses the media, propaganda to create heroic images of himself. Mao did this. He would do things like go out for a swim in the Yangtze River, and he would have it reported in the Chinese state media that, he swam this ridiculous distance and that he did it in essentially world record time, when in actuality, the photographs of Mao just show him floating in the river. That's this concept of the cult of personality, and it's not new. We've been talking about this concept of leaders using propaganda all the way back to like the very first rulers in world history, people like Gilgamesh, who created images of himself slaying lions. Now, Mao and Stalin are masters of this cult of personality. Hitler, unfortunately, was actually very good at this as well. Towards the end of the Cultural Revolution, Mao becomes a little bit upset with the Soviet Union. And so in order to make the Soviets jealous, one of the things Mao does is he meets with the United States and Richard Nixon. And the background for this is that the United States and the Communist Chinese had begun diplomatic relations by playing the game of ping pong together. There was ping pong diplomacy, which established relations between the United States and Chinese again. Mao dies in 1976, and following his death, we see this dramatic shift in the Chinese economy. So Mao was attempting to achieve the goals of a more equitable society by nationalizing the means of production. But following his death in 1976, China takes a different tact. So they move in the direction of a more free market capitalist economy. They give up that sort of dream or vision of creating a communist society, despite the fact that China still is communist because there's only one political party, and that's the Chinese Communist Party. Now, these economic reforms were led by the leader of the Chinese Communist Party following Mao Zedong, and that was a guy named Deng Xiaoping. And Deng Xiaoping and his economic reforms have been pretty wildly successful, right? Think of all the goods today that are produced in China. And we can see this in graphs like this, which show the relative GDP of various modern industrialized nations. And GDP is a measure of all the goods and services produced in a particular country in a given year. Here we have in 2010, the United States and China. Here we see the other major powers of the world: Japan, Germany, France, Brazil, Great Britain, and India. Now, projected out into 2025, we see the United States, and here we see some projections now of China starting to surpass the United States in terms of their total gross domestic product. Now, again, that doesn't take into consideration gross domestic product per capita per person, but it does suggest that the Chinese economy is growing very rapidly. We project this out into 2050 and we see the United States, and then we see China and the various other industrializing nations, including India, which has a very rapidly growing population and is beginning this process of starting to catch up with some of their industrial output. China in the last 5 years has also been involved in a project that I want you to be aware of called the Belt and Road Initiative. And what the Belt and Road Initiative involves is trying to rebuild some of these trade networks, the Silk Road, the Indian Ocean sea lanes. And they're doing this by supporting infrastructure projects, the building of railroads, the building of ports, the building of bridges in various other countries besides China that are maybe a little bit struggling more economically. Now, why is China doing this? China is looking back at their past and finding the formulas of success in the past. One of the ways in which China has been successful was by dominating both regional and global trade, whether it be under the Han Dynasty or the Tang Dynasty or the Ming Dynasty. China is recognizing that this is the way it becomes an economic leader in the world. China, however, has a number of other issues that it will have to confront in the 21st century. The communist government is very controlling. A good example of this, in 1989, there were some students at Beijing University that wanted to protest the fact that the Chinese Communist government was not very democratic. They didn't allow a lot of opposition. So they took to the streets in protest. In response, the Chinese government sent some tanks out and the Chinese army to quash this protest. And this led to this famous scene, which you may have seen, of a man essentially squaring up to a line of tanks. That man was eventually captured, and we don't know very much ultimately about him because he essentially disappears from the record. Now, the protesters eventually are fired upon by the military. This leads to a number of protesters dying, and this occurred in 1989. It's known as the Tiananmen Square Massacre. As a result of this, people are certainly more reluctant in China to go out and actively protest against the government because they're fearful of what the Chinese government might do to them. And so what we see in China is this growing government censorship of the media and of free speech. We see this in a number of other ways as well. In China, there are restrictions on people's ability to just simply go on to the internet and search on Google. There is no Google in China. There are government search engines that ultimately have all kinds of filters placed on them that limits people's opportunity to be able to access information about topics like Tiananmen Square Massacre or 1989. There are also websites that are blocked or restricted. So for example, you can't simply get on Facebook in China. There's a Chinese equivalent of Facebook that is essentially run by the government and that has all sorts of oversight, which doesn't exist in the United States. A third problem that China is potentially going to face in the 21st century has to do with their birth rate and death rate. So you can see in this graph here, this sort of spike in the 1960s. And the death rate, that was caused by the failure of the Great Leap Forward and 30 million Chinese people dying of starvation. We also see since really the 1970s a dramatic decline in the birth rate of China, and that's due to the one-child policy. Now, the one-child policy has been lifted in the last 5 years or so, but this is going to lead to all kinds of demographic problems for China because the distribution of their population by age is not one that's a very healthy one for any given society. You want to see more of a pyramid here because you want the base of any society to be the young, kind of healthy, strong people who are contributing the work necessary to sort of sustain and maintain a society. Here you're going to see China's elderly population very soon exceeding almost the sort of number of people that are young in China, and that's going to be a real drain on Chinese resources. So as a result of watching this video, you should be able to answer these two big questions. First, how did Mao implement Marx's theory of communism in China? And second, will the 21st century be dominated by China? Thanks for watching.